Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the Geological Society. I'm Richard Hughes. This is Martin Smith. What a great start to the evening. I am Richard Hughes and I'm the Executive Secretary around here. I'm going to introduce Martin, but just before I do that, a few housekeeping arrangements. Could I just please ask you all to turn off your mobile phones? If you haven't so done already, and also to let you know we've got no fire drills scheduled for the evening, so if you hear the fire alarm going off, it means the building's on fire and we need to evacuate. So if you're at the back of the room, could you just please make your way out through the main entrance through which you came? And if you're at the front of the room, the exit is to follow the green light and sign there into the courtyard and just stay in the courtyard. Thank you. I think that's all by way of housekeeping arrangements. So, yes, it's my pleasure this evening to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Martin Smith, MBE. Martin's the Director for Global Geoscience at the British Geological Survey based in Edinburgh, and he currently leads the BGS's Official Development Assistance and Department for International Development Programmes. So, international development, and the UK has got a very proud record of investment in international development. We're currently the world's second largest donor. Repeatedly re-endorsed at international summits since the 1970s, the 0.7% of GDP benchmark has become the measure by which the generosity of donor countries is measured. And we should be proud in the UK because we're one of only 6 countries, and certainly the only G7 nation, that meets this 0.7% GDP international development target. And I often think that when we imagine or when we conjure up images of international development in our heads, we think of humanitarian aid, poverty alleviation programs, and so on. But there's another kind of international development that, if you like, goes under the radar, and we can perhaps loosely corral all that under the title of technical assistance. And we in the geosciences, as in other technical disciplines, provide this kind of support to address issues such as natural hazards, to stimulate internal investment in developing country economies, and also to grow the abilities of local scientists and to strengthen institutions through capacity building. The British Geological Survey has a very long, very proud history of involvement in international development work. And Martin, this evening, is going to be telling us how geoscience research can contribute to long-term development goals that can truly make a very long-term difference. So please welcome Dr. Martin Smith.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Richard, for that kind introduction, and thank you to the Geological Society for the opportunity to talk to you this evening. But most importantly, before I start, I also want to acknowledge the input from numerous BGS colleagues, particularly those involved in the ODA programme, which I'll say something about later, for their support and input to this talk. So, you may be wondering from the rather bland title what this talk's about, and I've spent 37 years as a survey geologist working across the UK, but also across parts of Africa and India. And since 2012, as Richard said, I've been head of the BGS Global Geosciences programme, and more recently developing that programme into a much more of a development and applied set of activities and projects. And so what I want to do is take the experiences that I've had with various geological survey organisations, with research institutes and academics around the world, and to offer you, in the next 45 minutes, some insights as to how geology can make a difference and should respond to the growing world of sustainable international development. We're all geologists at heart. We all are passionate about the curiosity or the discovery science that we do. But I believe there's now an opportunity to step up and do much more applied science, to integrate our science with others to address some of the global challenges we're facing today. And fundamental to my talk is the concept of interdisciplinarity. I want to take you on a journey to explain what I think this means to me and how it can feed into geology, engaging in international development. But I'm going to start with the more intrepid traditional discovery story. This is Silali volcano in the northern Kenyan Rift. It's about 5 kilometers wide and about 300 meters deep. And I was a geothermal geologist 28 years ago as part of an overseas development administration project that was tasked with assessing the geothermal potential of 6 volcanoes in the Rift Valley. So what we typically would do is take off with a helicopter early in the morning to scout out for steam jets rising up through the volcanic deposits in the cool morning air. And on one such occasion, as the pilot flared the rotors to land at a promising geothermal site, a pride of lions scattered out from beneath a bush. The male and 2 cubs disappeared immediately, but the 2 lionesses stayed. And as the helicopter descended, looking down through the plexiglass at the 2 lionesses rearing up on their hind legs was a rather disconcerting vision, and I wondered what was going to happen next. The pilot came back, and eventually the lionesses disappeared. So we landed. We took our samples, and the modus operandi then was the helicopter would take off and go up to one of the sorry, I forgot to introduce the lions earlier. The helicopter would take off and go up to the crater rim and wait in radio contact until we had finished our traverse along the faults and looking at small volcanic cones for geothermal manifestations. After about 40 minutes of walking, we could hear lions roaring in the distance, and looking through binoculars, we were rather disconcerted to realize the lions had returned to the landing site and were now tracking our scent through the grass. We got on the radio. The pilot didn't answer. Why? He wasn't on his phone. He was on his Walkman in those days, and completely oblivious to the rising panic that was overtaking the group of us as we started to run through the grass looking for non-existent lion-proof trees. But there's nothing more disconcerting, I can assure you, to think that you might be on the menu. So the short version is the helicopter eventually got to us before the lions did. And so that's why I'm standing here today. And we were able to carry out the analysis of our samples, report on, and our recommendations were that this volcano Silali was probably the best bet out of the 6 volcanoes that we studied for development. This is what you might call classic discovery science work. It was reviewed by a group of international geothermal experts from around the world. We published maps, data, research papers, and I loved it. It was a great, life-changing experience, adapting to living to the culture in Kenya and having a strong sense of contribution to a developing country. But it's only now, 28 years later, that Silali is now up for development as Kenya's 3rd geothermal prospect. So the question you might ask is, why has it taken so long? Did we make an impact? Was the UK taxpayers' money well spent? And what of the lions? Are they still there today? Were they just another African story? And in 2014, I was asked, as part of the BGS undertook the research excellence framework exercise that all universities go through periodically to assess their research excellence. And BGS went through this in 2014, part as a test and a comparison of the work that we do. And I was tasked with finding out, from all the 20 years of projects that BGS had done overseas, evidence of impact. It was an incredibly frustrating task. There was very little evidence of impact. Did we actually know what it meant? Was it about creating an asset, a new mine, a new geothermal power station? Or was it about communicating research through scientific papers? Or was it about helping communities in some way manage, live with their economic development? Or was it about influencing decisions and policymakers and planners? It's all of these things, of course, but at the time, it was very difficult to find evidence that we could measure and put up from our discovery science that we make a difference. Because discovery science is often long-term in its impact. It's often hidden underneath other outputs and outcomes. And the acknowledged influence of geology overseas, particularly the assimilation of knowledge, the training, the capacity building of partners overseas, and the rather dismissively termed grey literature, the reports, the maps, that sit on a shelf for 20 years. How do we ever assess their impact and their meaning? Impact is now much more important. We live in a fast-moving, high-tech, data-rich society with a number of global challenges, as shown here on this graph. Food, energy, water security, adaptation to climate change, decreasing biodiversity, population migration, and the digital economy. Were we to start a Silali project today, would it be the same? I think not. I think it would be different, because we need to integrate and we need to think about it in the context of development. Because what we now appreciate, a bit like a mining company that's just discovered a large new deposit, we have to consider the environment, the water supply, the energy supply, the impact on livelihoods of the communities around that mine, or in this case, around a geothermal prospect, the social impacts. So we need to be able to embed, embrace our geology and our geoscience within a wider developmental context. And 2015 was the year things started to change, where the global community became serious about trying to address and find solutions to some of our planet's problems. 193 countries have given themselves 15 years to 2030 to make progress towards a series of international initiatives that include the United Nations Global Goals for Sustainable Development, the United Nations Habitat Settlement Programme, the COP21 Paris Climate Change Agreement, and the UNSDR Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. All of these initiatives bring scientists, policymakers, planners, NGOs, activists, and governments together to try and find solutions to our planet. So, and these solutions have to leave nobody behind. They have to focus on resilience, sustainability, what we leave behind for future generations. They have to look more holistically at integrating our science into looking at whole systems approaches. And most fundamentally, they must be people-centered. New partnerships and collaborations are required. So what I want to do in this talk is just explore a little bit about what we mean by sustainable development, some of the concepts and rules around the funding that is available for sustainable development. And I'll use a couple of examples, urbanisation and hazard citizen science, to explain what I'm talking about. And finally, I'll come back to Kenya and those lions. Sustainable development, what does it mean? The text on the bottom of this image is probably the most widely accepted meaning: development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Surprisingly, to me, it's not something new. It was actually stated and defined in the United Nations General Assembly in 1987. And of these global initiatives, the Sustainable Development Goals, or 17 goals that are shown here, held up by a group of participants at a recent BGS ODA workshop in Tanzania, are the glue that binds the disaster risk reduction and the urbanisation UN Habitat Programme together. So what I'll move on to now is to talk about the UK response to these global initiatives, as outlined by Richard. As the fifth largest economy in 2015, the government responded by committing UK to invest 0.7% of gross national income, which in 2016 is around 13.4 billion, to overseas aid and research for development and economic growth. And the graph on the right there shows this was part of a rising trend that started around the time of the millennium, of course, with the Millennium Goals, and continues to this day. Of course, it's not widely accepted. It has its detractors. Shortly after this was announced, the Mail on Sunday, raised a petition to stop this spending of 0.7%. And within a few days, it raised about 120,000 signatories. But fortunately, it didn't catch on any further and hasn't diminished the ability of the government and commitment of the government to pursue international development. But the other side of this, of course, is the international charitable sector in the UK, which is huge. 15,000 organisations worth around 3.8 billion. And so what we're looking at here is the balance between economic growth, wealth creation, soft power influence, combined with compassion, as was stated by Theresa May in her recent Africa visit. And as Richard said, the UK is very proud of its international commitments and its long-standing engagement with the global community. So that's the government response. What did it actually mean in practice? What it meant was that funding that was given to the DFID, the Department for International Development, was a chunk of funding was taken out and given to other government departments, including the recently formed UK Research and Innovation. And they now manage large pots of money. The GCRF on the bottom left there, Global Challenges Research Fund, is 1.5 billion over 5 years to encourage and stimulate integrated research, to link medicine, social sciences, natural sciences, to address some of those global issues I talked about. And looking at ourselves in the British Geological Survey, like other research institutes, we were tasked then with allocating a share of the funding that we receive from the UK taxpayer to overseas development assistance, the ODA programme, and I'll say a little bit about that shortly. And part of that funding is also to seek leverage, gain additional funding from sources like GCRF. So there's a stimulus here in terms of financial incentives to the academic sector, to the research institute sector and government to start working together and thinking collectively about these issues. The research that we want to do should align with the headline priorities of both DFID and UKRI. So the words you can see at the top of the screen are from the DFID white paper in 2015. And it's the high-level issues you would expect: global peace and security, responding to crises, prosperity, and tackling poverty. And if we look through the other literature in terms of where geology and geosciences might fit into some of those issues, energy is a key topic, particularly clean energy and decarbonising technologies. Global food security, feeding a knowledge of geology, minerals, and into soil to improve nutrition. Feeding knowledge of groundwater and its interaction with soils to increase resilience to climate change. And foundations for economic development, the digital economy, urban living, infrastructure, developing resilient systems to disasters. Geology has many different ways in which it can input to the Sustainable Development Goals. But there are some rules. It can only apply to the Development Assistance Committee countries, or DAC countries, as shown here. And they are listed in priority, so that the red is the lower income, least developed countries, and the upper middle income countries in dark green, you might be surprised, include China, India, Brazil. These are official rules that are decided by the global community. So whether we like it, agree with it or not, some British development assistance goes to India and China and countries like Brazil. But to be fair, the bulk of the focus is on the darker colours on this graph. So the programme that BGS is developing has to address those DAC countries. And what we have done is set up 3 research platforms, shown here. Platform 1 is looking at the integrated resource management in the East African countries, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Kenya, integrating water, energy, soils, agriculture, and mineral development. Second platform is on the resilience of Asian cities, developing again our platform of knowledge about working in the UK cities and also in parts of Europe to the cities that most at risk in Southeast Asia, and I'll talk a little bit more about those shortly. And the third research platform is looking at global geological risk, moving away from basic observation of volcanoes and landslides and earthquakes to actually look at the risk they present and the people who are exposed to those risks. These three platforms very much are not interdependent. They will interact with each other, and they pool the expertise in BGS together in ways that we've not done before. There are some other rules around sustainable development research that the BGS ODA programme is tackling. And I'd like just to explain a little bit more about these to you. First of all, new partnerships. The idea is that we have to co-design the research that we want to do to make an impact. It's not about us in the north, in the west, telling a development country, this is what you need and this is the best way of doing it. It's about understanding the cultural context and doing it together. It's importantly about interdisciplinarity. It's also about understanding that word I raised earlier about impact. What is the pathway to impact? And do we carry out monitoring and evaluation of the programs of work that we do? And finally, it's about capacity building, both in the UK and overseas. We need to bring the next generation of geoscientists and young researchers into these sorts of development programs, because they're the ones that will take it forward. So just looking very briefly at partnerships, to me, I think this is one of the big challenges of this approach to development research. It requires time, sensitivity to build trust, and an understanding of the historical and cultural context of the countries we're working with, and the ability to adapt to the way they do things, which may be very different and very frustrating to the way we do things. But also to respect the diversity of knowledge and skills that they would bring to the research table. And if we can, we want the research to be country-owned. A bottom-up approach is favoured. But we're working here from the UK, trying to engage with, in this case in BGS, with partners in 13 different countries around the world as part of the ODA programme. It's important to be able to work effectively. Face-to-face builds relationships. That's going to be difficult, but Skype, fortunately, is a great lifesaver in this way. Managing expectations, but also importantly, those 13 countries I just mentioned, we're not going to work successfully in all of them. Some of them are going to fail. And understanding why they failed and the lessons we learn from that will be important. And we need to engage, not just at our sister geological surveys or into other government departments, but we need across the piece, with communities, regional and national institutions. So partnerships, it's a new area, it's a challenging area. But equally so, and related, is the interdisciplinarity context. And that graph on the top left, if you look at imagine the red cogs are the geoscience community, our engineers, our water scientists, our landslide experts. We need not only to become more coherent in the way that we work together, but we also have to work out how we work with the social and economic scientists, represented maybe by the blue circles, or the policy planners and development experts in the green circles. It demands a high diversity of interaction and a coherence that links us together. And that is, I think, particularly challenging. To develop partnerships that share conviction and co-design, to recognize there are probably people out there we don't know who are good at acting as translators, facilitators, or synthesizers between the different science and research communities I'm talking about here. People who are able to look at the cracks and say, well, actually, you guys are doing this. There is a way of innovating this to make a difference, to help us reach solutions based on a better understanding of complex situations. So interdisciplinarity is something I'm got a bit of a bee in a bonnet about right now. I think it's something that we need to be able to do, but it's a complicated and challenging issue. Impact. What we're trying to do is attempt to intervene intentionally in social change processes. And therefore, we need some kind of framework. We have adopted the theory of change framework to help us in all stages of our thinking, our actions and monitoring and evaluation of what we're doing. And just to give you one example, it looks like a rather horrendous, complicated diagram. You can ignore most of the spidery connections and bits in the middle. The important things are on either side of the diagram. The green box is what we aspire, what we're aiming to try and do with this. In this case, this is Research Platform 3. We want to improve the resilience of communities to natural hazards. And the two other green boxes, those communities, of course, are the stakeholders in government and the stakeholders on the ground, the communities and villages where people live. And over on the left-hand side are the key interventions, the things that we're going to do to try and achieve that long-term aim. So that's about building relationships. It's about co-designing projects, as I've mentioned. It's about training capacity, building, knowledge exchange, and it's about the co-production of tools and things that we can build together that will help make a difference. And the idea of adopting a diagram like this within your project thinking is it's a live diagram. Every time there's a change, the A's and the numbers all represent assumptions that we're making based on evidence that we have now, the knowledge we have now. But that might change, and might change the way in which we migrate across this diagram. It's quite a powerful technique, and I'm very encouraged by when we had a couple of training courses in the Geological Survey about this. The staff that came out said that was one of the best training courses I've ever been on. It made me think about what I do in a very different way. So we've adopted this across BGES Global and BGES ODA programs. Monitoring and evaluation, not something we do particularly well. We tend to do a piece of research, finish a project, write the report, move on. We don't, very rarely, and that goes back to what I said earlier about trying to find evidence of impact, because we didn't evaluate and monitor it very well. Another major exercise involving people. Have we built partnerships? Have we improved internal learning? Is our science being utilised by the communities that we hope to use, who will use it, such as DFID at UKRI at high level, but maybe people on the ground, people thinking about hazards and policies? Is our science raising awareness? Does it have an impact on policy? And indeed, does it still relevant? Is it relevant to the Sustainable Development Goals? Are we changing networks, creating new networks of contact and partnerships? And finally, is it value for money? Can we justify the UK taxpayers' money being spent on this project work? So those are some insights into some of the aspects around the rules and the concepts of development research. Now, what I want to do now in the second part of my talk is move to a couple of examples. And the first one I want to talk about is urbanisation. The effects of urbanisation and climate change are converging. And as noted by the United Nations, about 55% of the world's population currently live in urban centres, and that is going to increase. They consume 78% of the world's energy, and they produce more than 60% of the world's CO2 emissions. So urbanisation is a major contributor to climate change, but it's also vulnerable to the consequences of climate change. And a recently released UN report stated that of the 1,146 cities in the world with a population greater than 500,000, 59% are exposed to at least one, and often more than one, natural hazard. And as a result, hundreds of millions of people around the world are exposed and vulnerable to natural hazards. For example, in Southeast Asia, it faces the perfect storm of challenges, including population migration, shortage of resources, including water, energy, minerals for construction. And unchecked, the Asian Development Bank estimates that by the end of the century, climate change could reduce the Southeast Asian GDP by up to 11%, affecting major sectors such as agricultural, tourism, fishing, and of course, human health. And that in itself would have a major impact on the global economy. But as noted by Jon Kloos, who is the Executive Director of the UN Habitat Programme, urbanisation itself can be a form of disruptive innovation that provides solutions to some of the most significant challenges we face. Climate change in Southeast Asia, as I've said, has significant impacts, and the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research predicts a shift in the climate regime by the end of this century for Southeast Asia, where the coolest summer months will be hotter than the hottest summer months were between 1950 and 1980. Rising temperatures reinforces local climate systems, combined with sea level rise, loss of land due to flooding, is going to result in the displacement of significant numbers of people. And the heat island effect of cities is well documented and understood. Rising temperatures will bring hotter nights because, of course, the asphalt and the concrete releases the heat that it's absorbed during the day and night. Therefore, increased water demand, increased energy demand. The waste heat, the urban pollution, the anthropogenic heat is already adding 1.75 to 2.5 degrees C to Japanese cities. So what's geology's role in urbanisation then? In Southeast Asia, cities are already responding to these economic and climate drivers I've just explained by exploiting the use of the subsurface. And in a typical city, in the top 20 metres, you will have your sewers, your gas pipes, your fibre optic cables, your utilities. At deeper depths, there will be shopping malls, such as in Montreal or in Singapore. There will be university laboratories. There will be living space, transport and human space. And at deeper depths, where many cities are now actively thinking, there will be opportunity for storage in rock caverns. We've just finished a large project in Singapore where they plan to move all of their surface storage of water, oil and gas underground. The opportunity for decarbonising energy through pump storage hydro schemes, geothermal energy, opportunity to tap into aquifers that many cities don't realise exist below them. So geology can make a difference and can help in the planning and development of cities in the future. But urban master plans for the underground space development require 3D volumetric planning rather than 2D spatial planning. They need to understand from the geoscience community the nature of the rocks beneath their feet, literally. In this slide, I'm going back to the concept of interdisciplinarity in the urban context. Yes, it's the outline of London with the Thames running through it, but it's a schematic diagram. It's not meant to be in any way close to the truth. But the point here is that beneath the city, as geoscientists working on subsurface conditions, natural resources, and waste regulation, we will probably need to interact with different communities. The old heart of a city, the old quarter, will be where history, arts and culture, archaeology is focused, and they will have different needs and interests from the subsurface, the particularly shallow subsurface, from what we have. But maybe in the outskirts of the city, around the greenbelt development, infrastructure, economic growth, again, we'll have a different need and input from geology. So what I'm arguing here is that the interdisciplinarity within the urban context requires us to speak to many different audiences and to understand their needs. And one way in which we're doing that now, I mentioned the research platform 2. We're seeking to develop an urban research platform for Asian cities. We have a project starting in Hanoi where for the first time we've got the Geological Survey to talk to the city authorities and develop a master plan for the development of Hanoi, which has plans to be a mega city with a population of 60 million. Similarly, Kuala Lumpur, a very modern and fast-growing city, has great plans for new metro systems. And we're also on the ground in Amaravati. This is President Modi's first smart city in India. It's yet to be built. There's a great opportunity as geologists to be on the ground to get the baseline data and understand the nature of the geology before the city is built. And tied into that is the opportunity to sensor our cities. A lot of our cities, of course, already have innumerable sensors on the surface, monitoring people, traffic, the meteorology of the city, the microclimates of the city. But very few cities have any sensors underground that are monitoring fluid flow, gas, temperature, pressure, movement. There's an opportunity in this program to start looking at how we can do that for better environmental management, help with adaptation to climate change, looking at cooling technologies. Are they feasible? How much water is there beneath the city? And can this feed in then into decision support tools and sharing of data across the spectrum? So I would argue that interdisciplinarity lends itself to tackling the issues and challenges around around urbanisation. My second example is on geohazards from the Caribbean and relates to how we can use citizen science to influence disaster risk reduction and long-term recovery from the cascading and multiple effects, including hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanoes that all affect many small island developing states, or SIDS as they're called. And previously, BGS worked for many years in Montserrat, and the eruption in June 1997 that led to the deaths of 19 people stimulated research into public understanding of hazard, risk and planning, And this led to some of our earliest thinking and experience around interdisciplinarity in the hazard sector, how we work with governments, how we communicate with communities on the ground who are directly affected by the hazards. And as a survey now dealing with hazards, characterizing their processes and their impacts, we recruit social scientists and communication experts to help us develop the integrated citizen science and innovative technologies that we want to develop to help manage that disaster management cycle. I'd like to give you an example of that. But before I do, just to clarify what I mean, or what I think I mean by citizen science, I like this quote from Richie Robertson, who is head of the National Emergency Management Organization in St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the Caribbean. And he made this at one of several BGS workshops where we've been engaging with the communities out there. And he said, I think a lot of what we call citizen science is people who have always been around observing nature, observing human systems and making conclusions based on that. A lot of people wouldn't think of themselves as doing citizen science. And so the challenge and the opportunity here was to capture that activity. And what we have done and are doing and hope to release later this year is a phone app called MyHaz, which will allow members of the public, the communities, anybody in fact, to first of all report to hazard, what they've seen, what they've witnessed, to report it in terms of where they are, in terms of photography, in terms of description of what they're looking at, to report it in terms of the impact it's having on them. If it's a volcanic eruption, are there any injuries, irritated skin, etc. So you can capture direct impact on people, and you can get confirmation that your observations and reporting has been accepted by the Disaster Management Committee. We've not built this in isolation. We started thinking about it after the Icelandic eruption in 2010, which of course closed huge areas of UK and European airspace, about how we manage and communicate these issues. And what we've done in these workshops is co-designed what that hazard app should look like at the front end, but also what it needs to deliver to those who are taking decisions. So not only is it about the public feeding information back into the government responsible, the committee responsible for making decisions, but it's also about that committee sending information out to people to say, yes, you must evacuate before the next pyroclastic flow comes down, or whatever it is. And this graph just is to make the point that we've carefully sat down with school children, with community leaders, with government officials and said, what is it that you need? What is it you want? Why do you need it? And how can we build it together? And what it is aiming to do is to link people and planners. A MyHaz app that you'll be able to download on your app, if you're so interested, will feed data into a dashboard where the decision makers and planners can look at the information that's coming in and make decisions about what they need to do next. But all of the data ultimately will be released through a portal so that everybody can see what is happening at that point. So, let's return to Silali. One of the reasons, of course, that it didn't develop over 20 years ago was because there was no infrastructure and no master plan for the development of this rather dry semi-savanna part of Kenya. But if it does, and hopefully it will, develop into a geothermal prospect, then it will result in the construction of an electricity grid, new roads, potentially a railways line. And so the development of Silali has a much wider impact on the communities and the lives of people around it. Ultimately, what we need to achieve is the ability to inform decisions that regard the trade-off between the environmental sustainability of an area and the economic development. And economic development in East Africa is a big deal right now. The countries are vying to become the economic hub. And it's driven by the idea of development corridors. And this graph, it's rather old now, shows the plan that by 2020, over 4 billion will be invested in the development of submarine fiber optic cables around the continent, and over $56 million on the terrestrial networks. A lot of this is now in place. And if it succeeds in completing it, Africa will be one of the most connected continents in the world. And that connection, and those connections through that fiber optic system, broadband systems, will also drive development corridors. And in Kenya, they have an ambitious plan to develop a corridor that links the oil and gas resources discovered up here in northwestern Kenya and across the border in Uganda, the newly discovered huge underground water aquifers that have been discovered, to develop new roads, new railways, new systems of development, new trade routes, etc., across the country, linking down to the coast at Lamu, where a new petrochemical refinery is proposed. You may not like it, but this is what the ambition for the country is. And it's even wider than just what you see here. This development corridor will stretch across to West Africa. So I put Silali on that corridor to make the point that these development corridors, which will help the economic growth of the country, also need to engage with, in this case, the local Pokot and Turkana tribes people to ensure that they also realize benefit, but also they need to understand and respect the biodiversity, recognizing that wildlife have migration corridors. And for me, one of the endearing, lasting memories camping in the African bush is listening to the flamingos migrating at night from Lake Magadi in the south up to the Soda Lakes in the north. If you put a whole bunch of electricity pylons there, what does that mean for the flamingos? Equally, what does it mean for the lions? I suspect they won't last long, if indeed they're still there. So, as geologists, we'll still do the discovery science. But now, as development scientists, we can align our understanding with adaptation to climate change, to the economics of water security, to wildlife, and to the environment, and to understand how what we might do in one small part of Africa has an impact and input to a wider development context. And as a research community, we must integrate and work together. We need to justify the social license that we need to do this kind of work, to ensure that the impact of the research remains unbiased, remains professional, and builds a sustainable future for all that is linked around the quality of research that we do, that it informs policy, it builds capacity for the long term, and demonstrates impact. Thank you for listening.
Questions? Who's going to start the question? Gentleman in the back there?
Is that on? That's on. Thanks very much. Tremendously uplifting and positive vision about the future of development. I'm afraid I'm a bit sort of appropriate for this venue. I'm a bit of an old dinosaur when it comes to projects. I think you've been describing a great deal about that. I was very keen to see your theory of change model being applied across what you do. Yeah. I've been a project and program manager for 40 odd years now, and one of the things I've found is clear objectives, clear responsibilities, defined deliverables, but more importantly, ownership of all those things. And sort of strikes me that the way we've got to use this dreadful interdisciplinarity word, which sounds like something from Blackadder, it's the very thing that makes it all a bit soft and... I don't get me wrong, I think interdisciplinarity is a great thing because nothing's ever done in a silo, but it sounds very much to me like it leads to soft thinking, blurred lines of responsibility, things not being followed through. An example I'd give is that recent, was it Indian Ocean tsunami, where 95% of all the tsunami monitors had been left to go to rack and ruin by the government that was supposed to be responsible for them. So can you build ownership into this? I don't really see who's in charge of any one of these particular things.
Very interesting question. I would say that there isn't any one person in charge of this, that is a collective responsibility. And that's the challenge that we've changed. That's what I've been trying to emphasize, that the initial work we did out in Silali was very much, this is what the UK government wanted to help Kenya develop its geothermal potential. We knew the best way of doing it, we'd go in and do it. But we weren't tasked with thinking about what would the impacts and the long-term sustainable development of that. You know, but choosing Silali just on geological grounds may not be the right answer. It may be the second or third option was actually a better answer, because when you take into account all the other activities. But what we've been trying to do is hold a series of workshops. In some countries we've been to, we said, what about the Sustainable Development Goals? Have you got a government committee, a government department responsible for this? And sometimes they say, we have no idea. We must have, but we don't interact with them. So we've sat down in these workshops with people from the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Water, the Ministry of several other activities that all have a bearing on what it is that we think we want to try and do and develop jointly. What are your priorities within those 17 Sustainable Development Goals? Which are the top priorities? In which case, what's happening in Kenya right now that needs to develop and support that? So we've very much tried to develop and co-design the research programs. So the leadership of that is what you're getting at, is, I think, a challenge we haven't faced yet. I think because we're coming with the money, ultimately we will have without being too heavy-handed about it, we will be deriving the direction in which the work will go. Nudging, thank you, yes, a much kinder word. But it is a challenge. That goes back to my comments about the partnership building. It's not an easy task, and it's challenging us quite extensively across the different cultures and countries that we're working in. Some things are going great, like the Caribbean example. Other things are barely moving. It's taken a year in Hanoi to get a city project off the ground because of the hierarchy of the communist structure in government. But anyway, yes, it's a good question, a good point, and it's one that we'll need all the luck on. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a fantastic lecture. Thanks. The question I have is this. You talked about the kind of resistance the media might present occasionally or time and again with regards to the 0.7% fixed budget commitment and all. And you also spoke of how you would, in your current exercises in Amravati, Hanoi, and other places, you're helping build some monitoring functionality and all that. Yeah. Could we strike a win-win situation by which, for instance, the thought leadership UK brings in these spheres helps them, those countries, obviously, and those monitoring functions, the facilities that you're helping deploy, they're capturing a lot of data. Some of the natural hazards UK is not going to face anytime in future. We are a more stable country seismically and all that stuff. So could there be a partnership in a way that, because data is the new resource actually, it's quite quite highly valued. So would we have a partnership with those countries that, look, we bring this expertise to the table and all that, but can we have not if not the exclusive right, or at least part ownership of the data that's collected. And that'll help us in terms of our university earth sciences departments
Exactly.
doing a lot better than we would have if we had not been spending the money there. So that sort of, in a way, helps that, it'll provide an answer to these naysayers that don't give money at all, and also, presents a viable case for why we should participate more. Is that a possibility at all? Yeah.
Very much, yes. The question was about the opportunity for UK wealth creation and trade and industry to develop, or technology to develop on the back of what these projects are aiming to do. And particularly in the urban context, there's a whole world of big data opportunities. And very much the ODA program also links into the innovation program and development of technology. So it may well be that within the smartphone app example I showed you, we've developed that primarily with our own software developers, but we want to be able to train the Caribbean software developers to take it on and develop it further themselves. And it may be that things will innovate out of that yes, we may end up in a partnership again where we can share technological innovation. It would be an ideal outcome.
I was just wondering how projects actually get initiated. Because I'm hearing that there are sometimes problems in terms of working partnerships, but that makes me wonder how they get initiated in the first place. Who comes to who with what?
Well, it's been a bit of a one-way dialogue up to recently, and now it's becoming a bit more of a two-way dialogue. If I use the example of the BGS ODA program, we were tasked with setting aside a share of our budget to develop a development research program, which we would build on the platform of experiences and knowledge we already had, for example, working in the Caribbean or working in East Africa. But we very much need to co-design that program. So at this stage, we're developing those partnerships, talking about the co-design, and looking at how we can then work together to bid for larger sums of money, maybe through that GCRF grant fund I mentioned. There are other, the Rockefeller Fund, for example, for urban projects. There are large areas of funding around the world, the Asian Development Bank, and I mentioned several times in my talk. They're all looking to prioritize the kind of interdisciplinary research that I've been talking about to bring researchers together. So right now, we're using our own funds to initiate the discussion and the collaboration. And if we want to try, we can bid competitively for grant assistance from UKRI, but the wider pitch is going to be bidding for funding from other sources as well. Does that explain?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay.
Nick?
Really interesting talk, Martin.
Thank you.
But the thing that struck me was it's a very long way from measuring 4 phases of deformation in the Dalradian, isn't it? And it just made me think that while these sorts of skills and ways of systems thinking are quite common amongst, say, geography departments and geography degrees, and in systems technology and so on, and sociology, they're pretty much absent from somebody who goes and does an earth sciences or a geology degree. I mean, do you feel that we are actually training earth scientists with the right skills to tackle this, or are we reliant on input from other disciplines?
I'm not really informed enough to answer that question in detail, but my perception, if I just take the examples of, a lady came up to me after my afternoon talk. She had a degree in economics, and she was doing a second degree in geology. And I said to her, you must finish that, but you will be a great translator. You will be potentially one of those synthesizers that can span between the different disciplines and think about how the research that we are doing in the future. So, and of course, many universities now give courses of joint degrees, geology plus something else. And I think that approach is going to bear dividends in this development science that I'm talking about. I had another questioner came up to me afterwards and said, I thought what you said was really useful. You should stand up in front of sixth formers and start talking about it. Maybe amend some of the slides, but you know, you've got a really important message. So I think, yes, we should do it.
You have a final question from the gentleman?
Thanks very much, Martin. You talked a lot about these projects, which are typically sort of government to government. Talked a little bit about research projects. Can you give some comment on where you see the private sector participating in these sort of projects?
The private sector is not excluded from some of these larger grant opportunities, but within the ODA program that is being set up, because it's funding that's coming out of taxpayers' money to UK, right now we're not engaging directly with the private sector. But I mean, there is a Prosperity Fund, there is an Innovation Fund, which is directly targeted to development of the UK industry and trade. And so there are strands of funding to support that. And what I would like to imagine is that someone like yourself, if you're presumably in the industry side, would understand and see what's happening within the context of this ODA program I've just been describing, and think where there may be opportunities for innovation of technology or better practice and standards for whichever aspect of industry is interested. So it's not excluded, but ultimately it's part of that wealth creation and trade which underpins and goes alongside the compassion element of the development we're doing. So I can't immediately say there's definitely a space within the BGS program right now, but I don't necessarily exclude it. If we can see an opportunity where we need finance or support from industry to develop something, then great. But I would like to think that you do it in partnership with your competitors, maybe in Vietnam, or you build a relationship there. So it's a joint venture.
Okay. Thank you. Can I just come to the lectern?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks. So it falls to me to conclude the evening's events and to thank Martin. But in my concluding remarks, I think I just want to build on something that Nick said. Nick, down here, by the way, is currently the president of the Geological Society, so I'm sure he'll be around afterwards if you'd like to have a word with him. But I should own up at this point that I spent many years working at the British Geological Survey. I've known Martin for a very long time myself, and I was very fortunate in the early part of my career to have a similar experience to Martin's in the East African Rift. I worked for a number of years in South America, in Ecuador, and I don't have any lion stories, but I've got a few about dangerous snakes and dangerous people I can share with you afterwards. But when I look back on that truly life-changing event and the work that we did there, I'm sure it does have impacts which are sustained to this very day. And in fact, I do know that the private sector has benefited very greatly from the work that we did out in Ecuador back in whenever it was. But I can't help feeling that we applied a bit of a blunt instrument, and when the project was thought out, it wasn't thought very deeply at all. And actually your question, I think, was very relevant. How are those projects initiated? I don't honestly know how the project I worked on was initiated. And I think the big takeaway for me from this evening's talk, Martin, is how much more sophistication and thought goes into the initiation and the planning of these major programs. And I think that's a really good thing. It's got to be the right direction of travel for all sorts of reasons. I mean, firstly, I think the thought and sophistication that goes into the planning is bound to maximize the chances of delivering those impacts, which are also important, not just for BGS, but for the countries themselves, for the host countries themselves. I think it would demonstrate the real value of international development investment, and hopefully, who knows, even get some of the monkeys off the backs of those from the people who think that it's money ill spent. I've spoken for long enough. Martin, it just forces me to say thank you very much indeed for a terrific and very stimulating talk this evening. I think that you're going to be around for a while if people would like to have a chat with Martin over a cup of tea or perhaps something even a bit stronger outside. Thank you very much indeed. What I was expecting was even better, actually. I mean, genuinely, there's so much more goes into planning these programs. I'm quite taken aback, actually, how much things have changed.
Yeah. It's been a real learning curve for BGS. I mean, NERC just said, you've got 3 years, you've got to spend 8.1 million, get on with it. And we said, but if we want to make an impact, if we want to demonstrate what we're doing, it's going to take us 2 years to get our feet under the table, get those partnerships set up, to actually understand